The morning Vesper Alden pressed her measuring stick into the mud at Alkali Creek. The sky above Sweetwater Basin had already decided what kind of summer it intended to be. Pale, washed out, the color of old bone left too long in the sun. No clouds stacked along the western ridgeline, no moisture thickening the air the way it should have in late May. Just that flat, merciless blue stretched from Rimrock Ridge to the low southern hills like a sheet pulled tight over something dead. She had been awake since before 4. Not from worry exactly, though worry was part of it. 2 years of working this homestead alone had changed the way her body moved through time. She woke when the dark was still total, when the only sound was the creak of the cabin walls cooling further from the day before, when thinking was possible in a way it wasn't once the light came and the work started demanding her hands instead of her mind. She had learned to use those hours. She had learned to use everything. The stick was a length of straight grain pine she had cut herself and notched at inch intervals with her pocket knife. She pressed it into the mud at the same spot she had pressed it every morning for 3 weeks. A particular bend in the creek, where a flat sandstone shelf gave her a consistent reference point, where the bank did not shift with rain or animal traffic. The water line sat below yesterday's mark, not dramatically, not the kind of drop that would alarm a person looking only at today. But she was not looking only at today. She was looking at 21 consecutive mornings, and what they added up to when she laid them out in sequence the way she laid everything out in a line in order, without letting any single data point carry more weight than it earned. She pulled the stick free, shook the mud from its base, and stood up straight. Her back registered the motion with the particular tightness that had settled into it over the past 3 weeks of digging. She pressed 2 knuckles against her lower spine, felt the vertebrae shift with a pop that offered no real relief, and began the walk back toward the cabin. Vesper Alden had come unto Sweetwater Basin by a route that could be described as circuitous, which was the generous word for it. The less generous word was lost, though she had never quite applied that one to herself, even during the years when it would have been accurate. She had grown up in Indiana, the second daughter of a family that had been one bad harvest away from ruin for as long as anyone could remember, which meant she had grown up understanding that the distance between having enough and having nothing was not the wide, comfortable gap that people who had always had enough liked to imagine. It was a thin line. It was a line you watched constantly and tried never to touch. Her father died when she was 16. Her mother followed 2 years later from something the doctor in town named, but that Vesper always privately thought of simply as exhaustion, the kind that accumulates over decades until the body decides it has carried its share and sets the load down. At 18, Vesper had been alone with the farm, a debt she could not service, and 2 options: sell what little there was and go or stay and watch the bank take it anyway. She sold first. It felt like choosing the direction of a fall rather than preventing one, but it was still choosing, and she had held on to that distinction. 4 years of moving west, work where she could find it, washing dishes in a roadhouse outside St. Louis, picking corn in Missouri through a harvest so wet the stalks came down black at the base, loading freight in Kansas City for 6 weeks until the foreman decided he could hire 2 boys for what he was paying her, and she found herself back on the road with enough money to get further west, but not enough to get anywhere in particular. She had not resented the foreman. She had understood the calculation and filed it under things that were true about the world and moved on. It was in Colorado in the summer of 1883 that she had worked 6 weeks for an old farmer named Calhoun Briggs. He ran a kitchen garden outside a small settlement, not a ranch, not a proper farm, just a careful acre of soil that he had coaxed into productivity through methods accumulated extraordinary. Deep red, heavy enough to strain the vine with a sweetness that had no business existing in that dry Colorado soil. Vesper had eaten one standing in the row and had simply stopped for a moment because it was the kind of thing that made you stop. She had asked him his secret, expecting compost, expecting some particular variety of seed, expecting something she could acquire and apply. Instead, he had walked her to the back section of the garden and shown her the ollas. They were unglazed clay vessels, each one roughly the size of a large melon, sunk into the earth up to their narrow necks. He had a copy of an agricultural manual he'd found years back in a Santa Fe supply store, a dense practical text that described the technique as ancient used by farmers in the dry Southwest Territories long before the current settlers arrived, a method of subsurface irrigation that worked with the physics of soil and root rather than against them. He filled each olla with water. The porous clay allowed the moisture to seep outward, gradually pulled, not by gravity alone, but by the pressure of the roots that pressed against the vessel from below, drawn by need rather than flood, by precision rather than waste. Root finds the water, he had told her, crouching over one of the clay necks with the ease of a man who crouched many times a day and had made his peace with the motion. Not water finding the root, you stop chasing it, you put it where the root will come. He had tapped the side of the buried vessel with one finger. Nothing wasted, nothing running off. Vesper had stored that information the way she stored most things, that didn't have an immediate application in a part of her mind, that was less like a filing cabinet than like a deep shelf where things sat undisturbed until the day they became relevant. She had thought about Calhoun Briggs perhaps twice in the 3 years since, the tomatoes occasionally, the ollas almost not at all, until 3 weeks ago when she had stood at the bend in Alkali Creek with her notch stick and understood what the numbers were telling her. She filed her homestead claim on 4 acres of Sweetwater Basin in the spring of 1884. The land was not the best land in the valley. Harlon Duval, who had been farming this basin since before Vesper was old enough to walk a straight line, had made that clear in the mild, impersonal way of a man who had no particular wish to wound, but also no particular reason to mislead. The soil was workable. The creek ran through the eastern boundary and had in most years provided adequate water for the scale of operation a single person could reasonably manage. There was a deep well on the property fed by an underground source that had never gone dry in the memory of anyone Vesper had been able to find to ask. The cabin she built in her first summer was modest but solid. She had chosen her materials carefully, cut her own logs, set her own foundation stones in a line she checked with a length of twine stretched between 2 posts until it satisfied her sense of level. 2 years of alone, 2 years of learning what this particular piece of ground would do when treated with respect and consistency and a willingness to adjust. She had made mistakes the way every first-generation farmer makes mistakes, and she had absorbed each one as data rather than failure. The section of the garden where she had overwatered the first year, drowning the root systems of half her bean crop. The fence line she had set too close to the creek bank, which had required rebuilding after the spring melt. The winter she had underestimated her firewood needs by almost a third, and had spent February feeding the stove with the kind of careful rationing that made the cold feel personal, like a negotiation with something that had specific demands. None of it had broken her. None of it had even come particularly close. She had a quality that she could not have named in herself, because it was too close to her. She spread her notes across the table the evening of the 21st day of measuring. The back of an old land survey form, its official printing long since obscured by her own pencil work. She had recorded each morning's waterline position relative to the notch, converting the raw measurements into a rate of decline. The numbers were not dramatic. That was the thing about a drought that came slowly each individual day was survivable. Each individual drop was explainable by heat or wind or the particular dryness of a given week. It was only when you laid them all in sequence that the direction became undeniable. 4 acres. The standard spacing for subsurface irrigation by Ola would require a vessel every 4 feet in a grid pattern. She worked the calculation twice, which was her habit when the result was going to determine a significant action. 300 pots, roughly. Buying them in bulk from a supplier, bargaining hard meant somewhere around $13 per dozen. She worked that number against the next number she already knew. The one that lived in a tin box under a loose board near the east wall of the cabin, and that she had not added to in 6 weeks. $47.60. Every dollar she had accumulated over 2 years of selling what the land produced, trading labor during harvest seasons at neighboring farms, and spending almost nothing on herself beyond the categories of survive and continue. She had never spent money easily. She had always understood it as compressed time, as the crystallized version of hours that could not be recovered once they were gone. She sat with the 2 numbers for a long time, not in the way of someone looking for a reason to refuse the arithmetic, but in the way of someone making certain they had the arithmetic right before they acted on it. The math said she could buy the pots and have $8 left. $8 was 3 weeks of food if she was careful. After that, the summer's growing season would either have produced something worth trading, or it would not have. And her situation would either be sustainable, or it would require a different kind of reckoning. She folded the survey form, pressed the fold flat with her thumb, and went to bed. At 3:40 in the morning, she was awake, and by 4 she was in the barn with a lantern checking the harness on her mule, with the systematic attention of someone who had learned the hard way that neglected leather becomes a problem at the worst possible time. She was on the road to encampment before the sun had cleared the eastern ridge. A day and a half. The road to encampment was not bad by Wyoming Territory standards, which meant it was manageable with patience and a mule who did not startle easily. Vesper's mule, a compact grey animal she had purchased in her first year, and named nothing in particular, because naming a working animal seemed like an invitation to sentiment she did not have room for, was exactly that kind of animal. Steady, unimpressed, reliable in the way of things that have decided their role and see no reason to deviate from it. She pushed harder than was strictly advisable on the second leg, arriving in encampment in the early afternoon of the second day. The pottery supplier operated from a low building near the freight yard, its sign hand-lettered and weather-faded, Edmund Gaul Earthenware and Supply. She tied the mule at the rail, checked that the water trough was adequate, and went inside. Edmund Gaul was a broad man with a manner that had been formed by years of assessing customers at the door and deciding several things about them before they reached the counter. His gaze moved from Vesper's face to her hands, to the wagon visible through the open doorway and back, and in the space of that movement, he had arrived at a set of conclusions she could read as clearly as print. $300. She set her terms on the table before he set his. Unglazed, 7 to 8 inch diameter. I'll load them myself. That's a considerable order for someone buying 300 pots, yes. She held his gaze with the mild steadiness she had developed for these moments. Do you have them in stock, or should I try the freight dealer on the other side of the yard? He had them. The negotiation took 11 minutes and covered ground that both of them understood was mostly performance. He started high. offered less than he expected. They met at a number that was within $1 of what she had calculated beforehand as the realistic outcome. $39 in coin counted out on the counter, while Holt watched with an expression that had recalibrated itself from its initial assessment into something closer to a professional attention. He helped her load the wagon without being asked. She noted it without commenting. She drove through the night on the second leg, arriving back at the homestead before full light on the third day. Her arms ached in their sockets from hours of holding the reins against the mule's steady pull. She ate a biscuit she had made before leaving, drank water from the creek, and began unloading the wagon in the gray early light. She had made it perhaps a quarter of the way through the unloading when she became aware of a presence at her fence. Amos Shrier, who ran 40 acres, 2 parcels to the east, and treated the boundaries of neighboring properties as suggestions rather than limits, had adopted his characteristic posture against her fence post weight on one elbow, one boot crossed over the other. The attitude of a man who has nowhere to be and no intention of going there in a hurry. What in the hell is all that? His voice carried the morning quiet without effort, the way voices do when they have spent years being heard across fields. Clay pots. She kept moving, lifting a crate of 4 from the wagon bed. I can see that. How many? 300. The pause that followed had a specific character. It was the pause of someone deciding whether to laugh. Amos Shrier decided to laugh not meanly because he was not a mean man in any particular way, but with the easy amusement of someone watching a thing they find straightforwardly bewildering and feel no pressure to conceal that fact. What are you planning to do with 300 clay pots, Calloway? Bury them. She set the crate down and went back to the wagon. That was the sentence that made its rounds. By the time the afternoon was half over, it had traveled the length of Sweetwater Basin with the speed that information travels in a place where very little happens, and people are consequently hungry for whatever does. By the time it reached the general store in encampment, which Vesper knew because she could see it on people's faces the following Sunday when she went in for flour, it had grown the particular distortions that stories grow when they pass through enough mouths. She had borrowed money to pay for the pots. She had been out in the sun too long. She had been strange since she arrived 2 years ago, and this was merely the expression of something everyone had always half suspected. At the gathering outside the dry goods store after the Sunday service, she could hear the laughter from a distance before the specific words became clear. She bought her flour. She bought a sack of salt. She walked back to the wagon without stopping to explain herself, because explanation assumes the audience is owed one, and she had not yet concluded that they were. Harlon Duval had been farming this basin since 1855, 31 years of seasons that had given him an authority in the valley that was genuine and earned, and had over time calcified into a kind of certainty that made it difficult for him to receive new information that ran counter to what those years had built. He was not a foolish man. He was not cruel, not dismissive in any personal way. He was a man who had survived 31 seasons, and that survival had convinced him, in the way that long success convinces people that the things he had always done were the right things, and that variations from those things were likely errors. His wife Vera had mentioned Vesper's purchase to him the way one mentions a local peculiarity, not with malice, but with the particular mildness of someone relaying information they find mildly perplexing. Harlon had received it in the same spirit. She worries too much about that creek, he had said in the way he said things when he was finished listening. Water comes back, always does. He had 31 years of it coming back. He had no reason from inside those years to expect that this time might be different. Vesper did not argue with him. She had learned early that arguing with certainty Work began on a Monday in the first week of June. She had drawn a grid on the back of a second survey form, one she had saved specifically for the purpose, mapping the full 4 acres in a pattern of dots spaced 4 feet apart in every direction. The math had taken her 2 evenings to confirm to her satisfaction, because satisfaction required not just getting the number, but being certain she had not made an error that would cost her pots in the wrong locations. Moisture distributed unevenly. The whole system compromised by a mistake she could have caught if she had only looked one more time. She broke the first ground before sunrise when the air was still cool enough to make heavy work bearable. The soil resisted. It had already begun to dry at the surface, the top inch hardening into a crust that required real force to break before the deeper layers became accessible. Each hole needed to be 10 inches deep and wide enough to seat the clay vessel with its neck just above ground level, then packed firmly around the body of the pot to ensure contact with the surrounding soil. It was not complicated work. It was not skilled work in any technical sense. It was simply hard work, sustained, repetitive, physically demanding, in a way that accumulated rather than peaked. Not a single moment of maximum effort, but hour after hour of the same motion, the same force, the same incremental progress across ground that did not give itself up easily. By noon on the first day, her hands had bled through the existing calluses. She wrapped them in strips torn from an old shirt, drank the water she had brought in a canteen, ate half a biscuit and went back to digging. This was not heroism. This was arithmetic applied to the body. She had work to do. She had a body capable of doing it. And the discomfort of the body was a variable to be managed rather than a reason to stop. By the end of the 3rd day, she had covered slightly less than a third of the field. Her shoulders had developed an ache that settled in not just during work, but at rest, a deep muscular exhaustion that she could not sleep all the way out of. She lay on her back in the cabin and stared at the ceiling boards and ran the grid calculation one more time in her head to confirm she was still on schedule. And then she closed her eyes and let what sleep she could reach take her. It was on the 5th day that she looked up from her digging and found a small audience assembled at her fence. The Duval family. Harlon Vera, their youngest boy. Ruth Holt with her daughter Dela, who was 12, and looked at the world with the specific seriousness of a child who has noticed that adults are mostly paying attention to the wrong things. A few men she recognized by face from the general store, whose name she had not yet had occasion to learn. They were not hostile. They were simply watching with the expression people wear when observing a thing they find difficult to categorize, somewhere between amusement and concern, between finding something funny and wondering if they should. Harlon called across the distance in a voice that was not unkind. "You doing all right over there, Calloway?" "Fine." She did not stop digging. "You need any help?" Vera's voice, pitched carefully, carried the particular gentleness of a question that is also an assessment. "I'm all right, thank you." She said it without looking up, without pausing, without any inflection that would invite elaboration. She heard them talking among themselves for a few minutes in the low, careful tones of people who have reached a tentative conclusion they are not quite ready to declare out loud. Then she heard them moving on. Amos Shrier's voice carried back on the wind. Something about digging herself right into the ground, followed by the collective sound of people who have found their laugh for the morning. She moved to the next marked spot and began the next hole. The second difficulty, the one she had not mentioned to anyone, was not the digging. The digging was hard, but it was simple. The water was neither. Once the pots were in the ground, they needed to be filled. Every morning before the heat of the day set in, before anyone with ordinary business would be passing on the road to see her at it, she had to carry water from the deep well at the property's northwest corner to the buried pots in each planted row. She had built a bucket system from materials she had on hand, a doubled rope over the well crank, a pair of buckets that allowed her to be lowering one while raising the other, a carrying yoke she fashioned from a fence board padded with folded canvas at the shoulders. On a morning when nothing gave her trouble, she could fill between 80 and 90 pots before the light shifted, and she needed to be doing other things. She planted the three sisters in the rows between the buried pots. Corn first pressed into the disturbed soil at the base of each staked position. With her thumb watered carefully from the bucket she kept separate for the young plants. Then beans once the corn had put up its first few inches of shoot climbers that would use the corn stalks as their vertical support and repay the arrangement by fixing nitrogen into the soil around them. Then squash, its seeds pressed into mounds between the corn positions. Its broad leaves designed by long selection to spread across the soil surface and hold the moisture against the Wyoming summer's efforts to steal it. The method was old. Older than the survey forms, older than the Homestead Act, older than the territorial government that had given her provisional claim to this particular piece of earth. She had read about it years ago in a hand-printed pamphlet that someone had included in a pile of materials she'd traded work for, and she had kept it the way she kept anything that seemed worth keeping without a specific plan for it on the chance that a specific plan might eventually present itself. By the third week of June, the plants were showing. Not dramatically, not in any way that would have attracted notice from a distance, a few inches of corn, pale and tentative. The first bean leaves opening like small fists uncurling, but the root systems were already reaching, already doing the invisible work that would determine whether any of this had been worth the cost of the pots and the weeks of mornings and the ache in her hands and back that had become so constant she had begun to think of it as simply part of her. Now a new feature of how her body moved through the world. She had lost weight. She could feel it in the way her clothes hung differently in the hollowness along her jaw when she pressed her fingers there. She ate what she could, which was not always what she needed, because the $8 was not a lot, and she had not yet sold anything from this season's work. She kept track of every expenditure in a column in the margin of her survey notes. She was not under any circumstances going to run out of money before the summer told her whether she had been right. It was the last Thursday of June when she heard Dela Holt's voice from the road clear, and carrying in the morning quiet directed at Ruth Holt, who was walking several yards behind her daughter. Mama, look, her plants are bigger than ours. They are greener too, and it hasn't even gone dry yet. Vesper did not turn around. She heard Ruth's footsteps slow and then stop. She heard the sound of a woman actually looking, not the polite glance that acknowledges a thing without registering it, but the sustained quiet attention of someone who has shifted from social observation to genuine assessment. The sound of someone revising something, a small internal recalculation made without words in the pause between one breath and the next. Don't stare, Dela. But Mama, come on. She heard them continue down the road. The conversation that resumed between them was lower and quieter than before, with a different quality than it had carried on the approach. Something cautious in it, something that had not quite been there before. 3 days later, Harlon Duval came by himself. He did not assume his usual position at the fence. He stood at a respectable distance from the fence line, a small shift in posture that she registered without commenting on. He cleared his throat in the way men clear their throats when they are about to ask something that costs them something. Mind if I ask you a question? Vesper straightened from the row she was checking, pushed the brim of her hat back, and looked at him across the distance. Go ahead. He was quiet for a moment that had weight in it. What exactly are you doing with the pots? She explained. She took her time about it, choosing language that was plain without being simplified. She described the clay's porosity, the had a book that described it, a method from the drier territories, older than anyone still using it. She paused. He had tomatoes that shouldn't have been possible in that soil. Harlon looked at the field for a long moment, looked at the sky. The creek was visible from where they stood, its flow notably reduced even to a casual eye, which his was not. Creek's down a third from where it should be, he said half to himself, the way a man states a fact he has been carrying privately, and now hears himself say aloud for the first time. Down closer to half. She kept her voice even. I've been measuring every morning. Something crossed his face at that. Not surprise exactly. Something more complicated. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen from him before. Not the genial dismissal of the man who had told his wife she worried too much, not the careful watchfulness of the man who had come to look 5 days ago. Something between apology and calculation. He touched the brim of his hat with 2 fingers. I appreciate you taking the time. He said it without quite looking at her, and then he walked back toward the road. She watched him go. Then she picked up a bucket and turned back to the eastern row where the corn was a few inches higher than yesterday, and the bean seedlings were beginning to find their feet, and the soil 2 inches below the cracked surface stayed cool and damp, no matter how many consecutive mornings came up burning and pale. What she had not said to Harlon Duval, what she had not said to anyone in the valley, was the thing she checked every evening with her lamp and her survey form and a pencil that was getting short enough to be difficult to hold comfortably. The well was deep. She had chosen this parcel in part because of the well, but the rate at which she was drawing water to fill 300 buried vessels every morning was not a rate that a well could sustain indefinitely. She had been doing the math for 2 weeks, adjusting the variables, rechecking her assumptions. The calculation came out the same way every time. If the drought held, if it held the way the creek numbers suggested, it might hold past July and into August without meaningful relief. She would begin to draw down the well in ways that could not be corrected by reducing her morning routine. She would reach a point where the system that was keeping her field alive would be consuming its own foundation. She had $8 and some coins. She had 300 clay pots in the ground, each one doing exactly what Calhoun Briggs had shown her they would do. She had 4 acres of corn and beans and squash that were growing, when nothing around them was, for the specific reason that she had acted on information that everyone else had heard as eccentric, and she had heard as necessary. Being right about the pots was not enough. Being right only mattered if the whole structure was still standing when the summer ended, and she could point at it intact and undeniable and say, "This is what I built, and this is what it proves, and anyone who wants to know how to do it can come and I will show them." She blew out the lamp and lay down in the dark. The night was warm and still in the way of early summer nights that are already practicing for something worse. Outside the creek she had been measuring for 3 weeks ran lower than it had the night before, and lower than it would run the following night, and she had known this was coming with the same clarity with which she knew everything that she had taken the time to actually look at. She was 23 years old. She had $47.60 when this started. She had $8 left. She had everything she knew about this valley, this soil, this water, laid out in pencil on the back of a government survey form, under a loose floorboard. She had the memory of an old farmer in Colorado standing in his impossible garden, pointing at a ring of clay necks in the soil, saying something she had stored without knowing she was storing it, in the part of her mind that kept things on the chance that they might one day be needed. The dark held her there while she worked through the numbers one more time. Not from anxiety, not from doubt, but from the same instinct that made her press the stick into the same spot in the mud every morning. The understanding that the truth of a situation these severe droughts always arrive not in a single catastrophic moment, but in a series of increments that each feels survivable on its own, until the cumulative weight of them becomes something else entirely. The first week brought temperatures above 90. The second pushed past 95. By the 12th day of the month, the thermometer nailed to the cabin's exterior wall had not dropped below 88 degrees even at midnight. When the Wyoming sky was fully dark and the stars were so dense they looked like something spilled rather than something placed. Alkali Creek stopped running on the 12th of July, not drying the deeper pools, retained their water dark and still in their sandstone cups, but the visible movement, the sound of water crossing rock ceased. Vesper had been expecting it for 9 days. She had already shifted her entire operation to the deep well, starting her morning fill routine at 3:30 instead of 4 to compensate for the longer carry distance, adjusting her bucket yoke so the load distribution worked better over the extra ground. She had made these changes without announcing them to anyone because they were operational decisions and not the kind of thing that required witnesses. What the creek stopping meant to the rest of the valley was different from what it meant to her. For the farms that had been relying on it as their primary irrigation source, it meant the end of something they had been counting on continuing. Fields that had been marginal since late June became critical in the third week of July. The particular smell of stressed crops, hot earth beneath, and above it, the faint sweetness of plant material beginning to give up its moisture, in the wrong direction reached Vesper across the fence lines on the still air of the worst afternoons. She recognized it without needing to see the fields that were producing it. Her own field, the corn, had thinned in the outer rows where she had reduced her filling frequency to protect the well's recharge rate, exactly as she had calculated was necessary. The squash leaves wilted slightly in the peak afternoon heat, going slack against the soil surface until the sun moved enough to relieve the direct pressure, then recovering. But the root systems were doing what they had been put in place to do. Press a hand into the soil 2 inches below the cracked, pale surface of any row in the field's central section, and the earth was cool and damp against the palm, maintaining a consistency that the surrounding landscape, its roads turned to fine powder, its fence posts dusted white, its grasses crisp to near transparency, had completely abandoned. She was filling the eastern rose pots on a morning in the third week of July when she heard Ruth Holt's daughter Dela stop on the road. The girl had been passing regularly with her mother since the conversation in late June, always on foot, always headed toward or returning from some errand in encampment. Dela was 12 and moved through the world with the alert stillness of someone cataloging everything she encountered for later examination. She stopped at the fence without calling out, just stood there. And the quality of her looking was different from the looking of adults who stopped, less the looking of someone confirming a suspicion, and more the looking of someone who has already moved past surprise into the more useful territory of trying to understand the mechanism. Ruth caught up, took her daughter's arm. "Come on, Dela, don't stare." But Ruth herself slowed as she passed the fence line, and the pause she gave the field was not the polite acknowledgement it might have been 2 weeks earlier. It was sat on the porch. Thomas Ruth, who had come around from the road while Vesper was walking to meet her husband, and Dela, who stationed herself on the step below the adults, with the focused economy of movement of someone who has determined that sitting still is the best strategy for remaining present in a conversation that might otherwise find a reason to exclude her. Vesper explained all of it. She took the time the explanation required: the porosity of unglazed clay, the way the soil's moisture gradient created a pressure differential that drew water outward from the vessel walls, exactly as fast as the surrounding root systems demanded it no faster. The three sisters planting and the specific logic of each plant's contribution to the others. The morning field schedule and why it happened before daylight. The fact that the system had to be in place before the dry period, not during it. Because root systems already under stress could not adapt quickly enough to benefit from a new water source. Thomas asked about timing. Could the same pots be reinstalled in spring, or was it better to make new ones each year? Ruth asked about the clay deposit Vesper had mentioned along Rimrock Ridge, how far the usable material extended, whether it was likely to be adequate for a larger acreage. Dela asked nothing, but her attention was so complete it was almost audible. A kind of concentrated silence that Vesper recognized because she had been that kind of child too. The kind that stores things before it is clear they will be needed. When Thomas asked the question she had been expecting, "Is it too late to put a system in this season?" she answered it honestly, without softening it into something easier to hear. For this season, yes, probably. The investment was in building the infrastructure before the crisis, not during it, because the crisis was already here and a plant already under drought. Stress could not absorb a new water source quickly enough to make meaningful use of it before the season ended. She watched Thomas absorb this with the careful stillness of a man receiving bad news he had already half anticipated. Then she said what she had been thinking since the Holts first slowed at her fence. "But the clay deposit is free for the digging. I can show you what to look for, show you the mixing ratio, show you how to form the pots without any specialized equipment. You start this fall, you can have everything in the ground before next spring's planting." She paused. The cost after that is time. Ruth Holt's expression shifted in a way that was not quite relief, but was something adjacent to it. The loosening of a tension that had been present so long, it had stopped registering as tension and had simply become the baseline condition of her face. Dela looked up at Vesper's hands then, both still wrapped in the single layer of cloth that had replaced the three layers of the worst weeks the skin beneath healing, in the slow, thorough way that skin heals when the original damage has been deep enough. "Your hands are still hurt," Dela said. Not a question. Healing. Vesper looked down at them for a moment. "Takes time. Does it hurt when you work? Some. Less than before." She considered the girl's face, which was waiting for the rest of what she was going to say. "Not more than I can manage." Dela absorbed this with a single nod. The movement of someone filing a piece of information into a category that already existed and had been waiting for it. Thomas Holt thanked her, replaced his hat with the careful gesture of a man who treats small actions with the same deliberateness he brings to large ones, and walked his family back to I've got maybe 2 more weeks before the corn goes, he said. Beans are already finished. 6 children and 1 more winter to get through. She waited. What can I do this season? What's salvageable? She thought about it before answering, which was her way with questions that deserved real answers rather than reflexive ones. She told him which crops had a chance of recovery with concentrated watering, and which had already passed the threshold beyond which investment of water would return nothing. She told him to cut his losses on the corn. It was past the point where surface water could reach the root systems fast enough to matter, and concentrate whatever water he had left on the root vegetables, which were more tolerant of sustained stress and had stored enough moisture in their underground portions to potentially carry through. She told him the same thing she had told the Holts about the pots about next season, about the clay along Rimrock Ridge. Amos listened with his jaw set in the way of a man receiving information that cost him something simply to take in. When she finished, the silence between them had the particular texture of an acknowledgement that didn't require words to be complete. He did not apologize for the laughter at the fence in June. She did not ask him to. An apology would have required them both to return to that moment and examine it. And there was no practical value in returning to a moment that had already passed and been rendered irrelevant by the one they were standing in now. I'll come by next week, he said, to hear more about the pots, about the setup for spring. Come when you're ready. I'll be here. He turned to go, then stopped. He didn't turn fully back around, just angled his head slightly, the way a man does when he wants to say something that feels better, said to a middle distance, then directly to another person's face. The well. I've been watching you carry water for weeks, more than you should be able to pull. He paused. If you're having trouble with it, there's a spring-fed source on the Pemberton boundary north side. Old Pemberton's been gone 2 years. His son hasn't set foot on that land since the funeral. Vesper went still. I could ask around. Amos continued still to the middle distance. Quietly. See if there's a legal way to get you access to it. The words came out with the careful deliberateness of someone who has practiced saying something and is now actually saying it and monitoring the gap between the rehearsal and the performance. She looked at him. This was not a category of offer she had been expecting from Amos Shrier. Her instinct, the instinct that had been the foundation of 2 years alone on this property, the instinct that kept the accounts clean and the obligations simple, was to refuse, to tell him she was managing and that she didn't need the complication of a favor she would then be required to have feelings about. She thought about the well. She thought about the numbers she had run by lamplight for the 3rd time the previous week, the numbers that kept coming out the same way regardless of how many times she adjusted the variables. She thought about what it would mean for the field if the well dropped past the point where her current fill schedule was sustainable. I'd appreciate it, she said. Not warmly, not with the performance of gratitude, but clearly the way she said things she meant. He nodded once, settled his hat back on his head, went. Jasper Shrier arrived alone on a Tuesday afternoon, which was unexpected. He was 17 with the self-contained seriousness of a young man who has recently begun to suspect that the way he thinks about things might be worth taking seriously, but is not yet certain enough of this to broadcast it. He had his father's broad frame, but not his father's way of filling space where Amos occupied a room or a fence line as a kind of claim. Jasper occupied space tentatively, as if checking first whether it was needed. He asked with the careful phrasing of someone who has considered how to present a request whether he might walk through the field to look at something he had been thinking about. What are you looking for? Vesper asked. Whether the yield is consistent across all the sections, or whether some parts are performing better than others. I've been thinking about whether pot space He opened the notebook to a page dense with small figures. The northwest corner, he said. The squash canopy is shading the bean plants. The beans are thinner there by a significant margin. That corner gets less morning sun to begin with because of the rimrock shadow, and then the squash takes what's left. Vesper did not respond immediately. She had noticed the thinness in the northwest beans. She had attributed it to soil variation without fully examining the attribution. He had followed the logic further than she had. The squash needs more lateral room in that section, she said. Wider spacing on the pots would give it somewhere to spread that isn't directly over the bean rows. That's what I thought. He wrote something in the margin. Could I come back in the spring to see how a change spacing affects it? You can. He looked up from the notebook. The question that followed was more direct than he had intended it. She could see that in the slight shift of his expression a moment before the words came. Even if the drought ends and nobody else is paying attention anymore. The question was really asking something else. It was asking whether any of this was real, or whether it was only the emergency that had made it seem real. Whether she would still be worth seeking out once the crisis passed, and people went back to thinking that what she had done was either luck or strangeness. The two categories into which things that didn't fit the existing understanding tended to be sorted. Even then, she said, come back. The county letter arrived during the third week of August on a morning when the temperature was still bearable, and she was working the far edge of the western section. She recognized the seal before she had opened it, the particular weight of official paper, the formal letterhead of the Sweetwater County Land Office. She had been expecting something like this in the diffuse way she expected things that were inevitable rather than immediate. But the timing still produced a brief interior tightening that she registered honestly as anxiety before setting it aside and doing what she always did with anxiety, which was to read the thing that was causing it rather than continuing to imagine it. Surveyor. Silas Pruitt would be visiting the property in September to complete a routine improvement certification assessment. The Homestead Act required continuous occupation with demonstrable improvement over 5 years before final title transferred. Vesper was at 2 years and 4 months. She had 32 months remaining. She set the letter on the table, went outside, finished her work on the western section, came back in the late afternoon and read it again. Her field was the most verifiably productive land in Sweetwater Basin this particular summer. That was simply true. The cabin she had built herself was structurally solid and had been maintained through 2 winters without significant deterioration. The well was functional, though under pressure, that she had been tracking carefully. The 300 buried vessels represented the largest single agricultural investment any parcel in the valley had seen this season, not in terms of dollar cost, but in terms of the labor required to implement them, and the demonstrable change in the field's productive capacity. By any rational measure of improvement, she was exceeding the requirements. What she could not assess from inside the situation was how Silas Pruitt would define his terms. Land offices ran on interpretation, as much as fact on precedent, as much as present evidence. A surveyor who had never encountered a subsurface irrigation system built from buried clay pots might read, the unconventional as problematic might understand unfamiliar as unproven. She did not know Pruitt. She did not know which of these possibilities he represented. She folded the letter into the tin box and went to fill the afternoon pots, and decided not to carry the uncertainty of it while she worked, which she managed with partial success. The community's relationship to her had not rallied. That word implied a shared movement, a collective pivot, a consensus reached. What had happened was more particular than that, more human, more individual. People were coming to her separately in the configurations of those who had privately made a decision in groups of 2 or 3 who Martha Fenwick came on the last Saturday of August with the Garfield brothers, who had driven from the far end of the basin, and two other families Vesper had not previously met. Martha was a woman of perhaps 60, heavy-set and unhurried, with grey hair cut to a practical length, and hands that had been worked hard for so many decades. They had arrived at a kind of distillation. The unnecessary had been worn away, and what remained was essentially functional. She farmed 120 acres by herself since her husband had died 4 winters back. She walked through the rows of Vesper's field without speaking, touching the squash leaves, bending over sections of soil, pressing her palm against the earth, with the particular attention of someone who has long since stopped needing to perform observation and simply does it. When she reached the far end of the field, she turned around. "How much did the clay cost you?" "Nothing. There's a deposit along Rimrock Ridge, 4 miles north." Martha calculated without a pencil, working the numbers in her head with the ease of long practice. 120 acres. I'd need a minimum of 800 vessels. She paused. That's a considerable amount of winter work. Start in October, you can have them ready before late March. Enough time to get them in before spring planting. You'd show me the mixing process. Yes. The technique for keeping them from cracking before they're set. The critical thing is the drying time. 3 weeks minimum. Rushing it is where most of them fail. Vesper hesitated. I lost 30 to cracking before I worked out the right ratios. You won't have to lose as many. Martha looked at her with a directness that was neither warm nor cold, but simply accurate, the look of a woman who has learned to spend her attention only where it will be returned at value. You don't fire them. Firing seals the pores. That defeats the entire purpose. Martha went briefly still, then immediately assembled the logic. Of course, the moisture has to pass through the wall. She shook her head slightly, not at Vesper, but at something internal, the simplicity of the principle once it was stated, the way obvious things conceal themselves until someone says them. I've done some pottery work over the years, mostly functional where nothing decorative. I've been thinking about a low-firing 100 to 150 degrees for a few hours, enough to firm the structure for handling without closing the pores. She paused. I could be wrong. I haven't tested it. If you test it, I want to know what you find. Martha set the pot she had been holding back on the soil surface. I'll tell you. No elaboration, no performance of commitment. Just the plain statement of a person who says what they mean and expects the same in return. The rest of that Saturday had the quality of a thing that was larger than its components. 14 people in 4 acres of field on a late August morning, asking questions that were real questions, the kind that come from a person who has decided to understand something rather than simply observe it. The Garfield brothers about soil composition in different parts of the basin. Their cousin Nate, who had driven 3 hours and apologized for arriving uninvited, with an earnestness that made the apology unnecessary before it was finished, about whether the method could be extended to crops other than the 3 sisters. Vesper told him honestly she didn't know that she had only tested what she had tested, that the underlying principle should extend to any deep-rooted plant, but that she could not speak to what she had not tried. He wrote that down. She was better at this than she had expected. Not because explaining came naturally to her, it did not in the way it comes naturally to people who are drawn to an audience, but because she had the quality of a person who was willing to describe what had gone wrong as readily as what had gone right, and that honesty made the successful parts of the account carry a weight that pure enthusiasm would not have given them. People trusted information from someone who acknowledged the cost of acquiring it. Silas Pruitt arrived on a Tuesday in the first week of September had a brief internal debate about whether to clean up, to present the property and herself with the additional formality that an official visit seemed to warrant, and had decided against it in the space of that brief debate on the grounds that what the property looked like in the condition of actual use was more honest evidence than what it looked like dressed for inspection. Pruitt was a tall man in his middle 50s with a grey moustache and the economy of movement that comes from doing the same work for decades and learning which parts of it matter. He extended his hand without hesitation, which she registered, and shook hers with the same pressure he would have used with any hand, which he also registered. He walked slowly along the perimeter of the field, pausing frequently, actually looking rather than performing the motions of looking. He stopped at the eastern section's central row, crouched, pressed his palm flat against the soil surface, and held it there. Longer than Thomas Holt had held it. Longer than Amos Shrier's son. He was not confirming something he expected. He was actually feeling what was there. 2 inches down, he said, not as a question. 5 to 8 centimeters from the surface. The vessels are at 25 centimeters. He stood, looked across at the visible condition of the surrounding properties. The Duval land to the north exhausted the topsoil, lifting at its edges in small pale curls. The road verge brittle as old paper. When did you install these? June, before the creek stopped. Before. He said the word with a quality that was not quite surprise, more like the placement of a fact into the position it had been waiting for. She told him about Calhoun Briggs then, the short version, the old farmer in Colorado, the book. He had the technique. It described the way she had stored the information for 3 years before the numbers from her morning creek measurements gave it somewhere to go. Pruitt asked 3 follow-up questions, all practical, all aimed at the mechanism rather than the biography. She answered them. Then, how is the well holding? The question arrived with a professional neutrality that she had no reason to distrust, but could not help evaluating as she heard it. She looked at him directly. Managing. It's down from where it was in June. I've been tracking the draw rate. The water table across this basin has dropped significantly this summer. Several properties on shallower wells have experienced serious supply problems. I'll need to record the well depth and your current extraction rate in the assessment. I have that data. I've been recording it daily. She paused. The numbers are on the same form I've been using for the creek measurements. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but the quiet acknowledgement of someone who has encountered a variable they had not anticipated and are now incorporating it into an assessment that is becoming more interesting than they had expected. They sat at the table for 20 minutes. She read him the numbers from the survey form dates, water levels, extraction rates, the adjustments she had made to her daily schedule in response to the rate of decline. His assistant recorded everything. Pruitt twice asked her to repeat a figure, and she repeated it without impatience. When it was over, he folded his hands on the table and looked at her in the way of someone who has completed an assessment and is organizing what to do with it. The cabin is solid. The field improvement exceeds minimum requirements by a meaningful margin. The irrigation system is... He stopped for a moment. That was genuinely a pause for the right word, rather than a pause for effect. Novel. I haven't encountered its equivalent in this district. That's an observation rather than a problem. He stood, collected his hat from the table's edge. At the door, he paused with his hand on the frame. If the well situation becomes critical before the drought breaks, the county has an emergency water resource program. I'd encourage you to apply sooner rather than later. He said it the way someone mentions a shortcut on a road you haven't asked about but might need. Then he walked to his wagon and was gone. She sat at the table for a moment after the sound of wheels faded down the road. Then she took the survey form from the table, dated the margin with today's date, and added it to the stack in the tin box. She applied for the water resource program the following week, driving into encampment in the same wagon that had carried the clay pots from Edmund Gaul's supply yard in June. The county clerk who processed her application was young and visibly uncertain about paperwork he had clearly not encountered before. He made 2 trips to a back office to retrieve forms that turned out not to exist for the specific category her situation presented. On his second return, setting a form on the table with the careful movement of someone not entirely sure what they are handling, he asked whether the clay vessel system she was describing fit under any existing category. Subsurface passive irrigation, Vesper said. If you need a category, he wrote it down with the visible relief of someone who has been given a label for a thing that was beginning to feel dangerously unlabeled. She signed 3 documents, was told to expect a response within 60 days, bought flour salt, a new pair of work gloves on the way out, and drove home in the afternoon heat with the particular lightness of someone who has done what there was to do and has now handed part of the problem to a process that will work on its own timetable. By the last week of August, the visitors to her fence had become daily. They arrived in ones and twos and once in a group of 4 that included the Garfield brothers' cousin, who had apparently been telling people about what he had seen on his 3-hour drive, and 2 farmers from the northern end of the basin who had heard about the field from someone who had heard about it from someone else and had driven an hour to see it themselves. She talked to all of them. She repeated herself a dozen times across different conversations without the repetition bothering her. The goal of any given conversation was not novelty, but comprehension. Not the pleasure of saying something new, but the practical result of someone leaving with enough understanding to actually do something with it. What bothered her was not repetition. What bothered her was the thought of someone walking away with only a partial account. Enough to think they understood, but not enough to avoid the mistakes that came from partial understanding. Vera Duval came on a Wednesday afternoon without Harlon, which meant it was both easier and harder easier, because Harlon's 31 years of certainty were not in the room harder, because Vera was clearly carrying the weight of what Harlon had not yet decided to know. She listened with complete attention and asked good, specific questions about soil depth variation across the basin and whether the clay composition at the Rimrock deposit was consistent, or whether different sections would require different mixing ratios. She left with a hand-drawn diagram of the pot spacing grid and the planting pattern folded carefully in her coat pocket. At the gate, she stopped. "My husband thinks it's luck." Her voice was careful, placing the word in front of Vesper without quite handing it over. "He might be right." Vera looked at her steadily. "Do you think it's luck?" "I think I worked very hard on something I had specific reason to believe would work." She held Vera's gaze. "Whether that's luck depends on how you define the word." Vera was quiet. Then something in her face settled. "I'll bring him eventually." She said it the way people state things they have decided are simply true and are reporting rather than predicting. "He'll come when he's ready." The heat broke on the 21st of August, not because rain came, but because a front moved down from the north that dropped the temperature 15 degrees in a single afternoon and made the evenings cool for the first time since June. Vesper stood on the porch and felt it move across her arms and breathed it in. She allowed herself 1 full minute of simply standing before she went back to the work that had not stopped because the temperature had changed. Her hands were healing. The worst splits near the base of her right thumb were still walked to the edge of the field in the long evening light and let herself actually look at it. She had been too close to it, too consumed by the logistics of maintaining it to see it whole for weeks. What she saw in the cooling air of that late August evening was this: the corn standing at shoulder height, the beans thick on their stalks, the squash spread in wide heavy-leaved mats between the rows, the whole field lit gold by the last angle of sun before it dropped behind the ridge. Everything around it. The Duval land to the north, the partial view of the Shrier property to the east. The road verge, the creek bed, was the brown exhausted color of a landscape that had given what it had and received nothing back. Her field looked like something from a different month, a different season. She stood in it long enough to feel its full weight. The cost of it, the weeks of dark mornings, the blood on her hands. The $8 in the tin box, the well, dropping in increments she tracked in pencil. The laughter from June that she had never answered with anything but continued work. She felt all of it at once as a complete thing, rather than a collection of separate difficulties. Not pride, not triumph, something quieter than either. The plain, sober satisfaction of a structure that had been built correctly and was therefore standing. She went inside, ate a cold supper of beans and cornbread, fell asleep sitting up at the table before she finished the last piece. The harvest began on the first Monday of October, under a sky that had finally remembered it was capable of something other than punishment. Thin clouds moved from the northwest, not the kind that carried rain, but at least the kind that suggested the atmosphere retained the possibility of intention. The temperature stood at 41 degrees when Vesper opened the gate at first light and found Ruth Holt already inside the fence line, having let herself in through the latch without knocking, which was the act of someone who has decided that a certain formality no longer serves the situation. Ruth carried a canvas bag of tools over one shoulder. Dela stood beside her mother with the focused economy of someone who had dressed for work rather than for arriving. "You're early," Vesper said. Ruth was already moving toward the eastern row. "We left early." The simplicity of it was its own complete statement. Vera Duval came an hour later with her son Warren, who was 15, and had the particular efficiency of a boy who had been doing farm labor since he could hold a tool straight, and had long since internalized the understanding that the work was the point, not the performance of working. Vera pressed a cloth-wrapped bundle into Vesper's hands without explanation or introduction. Vesper set it aside and opened it at noon, sitting on the ground at the field's edge because there was no reason compelling enough to walk to the cabin. 2 meat pies, still faintly warm from the Duval oven, wrapped in a cloth that smelled of wood smoke. The corn came in across 3 days. What the harvest revealed was the field's own record. The map of every decision she had made over the summer, rendered visible in weight and yield rather than in pencil marks on paper. The central rows where the pots had been buried at the correct depth, where the spacing had given each plant the moisture gradient it needed, without competing with its neighbors, came in heavy. Ears with tight husks, kernels that ran full to the cob. The kind of yield that represented a calculation that had been right rather than approximate. The northwest corner where Jasper Shrier had stood with his notebook and correctly identified the squash canopy casting shadow. On the bean rows thinner, the ears smaller, the beans noticeably sparse. 2 sections of the southern edge where she had buried the pots at shallower depth in early June, when the soil had resisted the full 10 inches she had planned. Uneven yield, inconsistent moisture distribution. The ground's way of confirming that the variable she had changed there had in fact been the relevant variable. Warren Duval worked beside Dela for most of the first day without speaking more than was required by the work itself. On the third afternoon, when the wagon was loaded with the last of the corn, he stopped at the end of the row and looked at what they had accumulated. expression was not theatrical. It was the expression of someone doing arithmetic and arriving at a number larger than their estimate. "That's a lot of corn," he said finally. "It is," Vesper agreed. He looked at her directly with the particular quality of a young man who has decided that directness is more efficient than anything else. "My father said you'd lost your mind when you bought those pots." "I know he did. He sharpened your harvesting tools." He said it without emphasis, just as fact, his eyes already moving back to the loaded wagon. "Left them at your fence post. Blades were bright when you picked them up." "I noticed." Warren considered this for a moment, apparently determining that it constituted a complete thought, and picked up the next armful of dry stalks. The beans came in over 2 days following the corn, the squash over 2 more after that. When the last of it was stacked in the root cellar and spread across the barn floor, Vesper sat down on the barn's earthen floor with her back against a bale of last year's hay and pulled a piece of paper from her coat pocket. The original survey. Form the one she had used for everything creek measurements well. Data the pot grid, the planting diagram. The yield projections she had calculated in June before she had spent a cent or broken a foot of ground. She unfolded it and read the numbers she had written 4 months earlier in the column she had labeled Simply Expected. The actual numbers she carried in her head, fresh from the past 5 days of counting, weighing, measuring. She compared them column by column. The central rows had come in within 8% of projection. The northwest corner and southern edge had come in below, but she had known they would had adjusted her expectation when she identified the variables, and even those sections had produced something rather than nothing, which was more than could be said for most of what surrounded her property. The overall yield was within 10% of what she had written on this form before anyone in the valley had stopped laughing long enough to look at what she was actually doing. She sat with that for a while, not with pride, which would have required an audience, and she had none, but with something more private than pride, a reckoning between the person who had pressed that measuring stick into the mud in May and the person sitting on a barn floor in October with the harvest cellar full enough to carry her past the winter and into the spring with room to plan rather than desperation to survive. She folded the paper, replaced it in her coat, and went to check on the pots. The extraction demonstration she had been planning since August happened on a Saturday in the second week of October. After Dela Holt had served as a more efficient communication channel than anything the county postal system had managed to provide that summer. 14 people came through the gate at various points during the morning. The Holt family, the Garfield brothers, their cousin Nate, who had driven 3 hours again, and arrived with the same apology he had apparently been carrying since August. A young couple who had filed a homestead claim on the basin's far eastern edge the previous spring. Martha Fenwick, whose presence Vesper had not been certain of until she appeared at the fence line and let herself through with the self-possessed ease of someone who goes where she has decided to go. Vesper had extracted a 10-pot section of the eastern row the previous evening, so the demonstration could show the full sequence without making the group wait for each stage. She brought them to that section first. Dig around the neck, not into it. She was already crouching in the first cleared hole, her trowel angled to move soil away from the vessel's shoulder rather than against it. The clay is intact, but it is not indestructible. If you leave her from the side, you'll crack it, and a cracked pot cannot maintain the pressure seal. She worked the soil loose with the particular care of someone who has learned through 30 failures exactly what the right motion felt like, and lifted the pot free. It came up whole gray-brown, the exterior crusted with the fine silt of the surrounding earth, a dark band around its midsection where 4 months of moisture had concentrated against the clay wall from outside. This vessel was filled every morning for 118 days. clay does not degrade under these conditions if you handle it correctly. You can use the same pots next season. Jasper Shrier was crouching at the edge of the cleared hole before she finished speaking, looking at the disturbed root zone with the focused attention of someone working a problem. He touched the soil carefully. The roots came toward the pot. They are wrapped around where the clay was not through it. Correct. The clay wall stops root penetration. The roots press against the exterior, and that pressure is what drives the uptake. It's not passive absorption, it's active demand. The root is reaching for what it needs. The clay regulates the rate at which that need is met. If the pot cracks, the roots enter the vessel and the seal is broken. You lose the pressure differential. You lose the mechanism. She walked them through the remaining extracted section, pot by pot, answering the questions as they surfaced. Thomas Holt asked about reinstallation, whether returning a pot to its original location was preferable, or whether moving it offered any advantage. Nate asked about root competition between the three sisters when the season ended and the plants were cut back, whether the remaining root mass affected the soil composition around the vessels over time. It was a question she had not been asked before, and she told him she didn't have an answer from her own experience, but that the soil she had pulled from around today's extracted pots was noticeably richer in organic material than the surrounding earth, which suggested that whatever was happening between the root mass and the clay-adjacent soil over the course of a season was not neutral. He wrote that down. She noticed 3 other people also had notebooks. Martha Fenwick had been standing at the edge of the group, through the whole demonstration, arms folded, watching without asking. When the group began to disperse into smaller conversations, she moved to the cleared section and crouched over one of the extracted pots. She turned it in her hands, examining the exterior surface with the attentive hands of someone who knows materials from long practice rather than from reading about them. Low fire. Martha said it without preamble, still looking at the pot's exterior. 100 to 150 degrees 2 hours firms the structure enough to reduce handling breakage without affecting porosity. The pores stay open at those temperatures. Vitrification doesn't begin until you're well past 300 degrees. I tested it over the past 6 weeks. She set the pot down and looked at Vesper directly. Breakage rate in my test batch of 42 cracked during drying, none during handling or installation. The unfired batch of the same clay lost 6 during handling. The group had gone quiet. Vesper thought it through before responding the physics of clay at low temperature. The distinction between structural firming and pore closure. What Briggs had done with air drying only in Colorado's drier climate. Your climate is wetter than where the technique was originally described to me, she said finally. That may mean the air drying process is less reliable here. A low fire that maintains porosity while improving structural integrity could address that without compromising the mechanism. She paused. I want to test it myself this winter with the clay from the deeper deposit along Rimrock Ridge. I'll send you my notes. Martha stood with the unhurried ease of a woman who has spent decades getting up from ground level. The test results, the temperature log, the clay composition I used. I'd value that. Martha looked at her with the level accuracy that was apparently her characteristic mode of seeing people. You didn't know this when you started. I knew the principle. I didn't know everything about the application. Vesper held her gaze. I still don't. That's why your test matters. Something in Martha's expression shifted not to warmth exactly, but to a kind of professional respect that was in its way more substantial than warmth. She left with the Garfield brothers when the group dispersed, and Vesper watched the wagon move down the Amos Shrier stayed after everyone else had gone, which she had not expected, but found she did not object to. He began filling the extracted holes without being asked, working with the methodical efficiency of a man who has been doing physical labor for enough years that his body finds useful employment automatically. They worked parallel for a time in the kind of silence that exists between people who have shared a complicated history and arrived through various routes. At a point where the complexity has settled enough to simply work beside each other. There's something I need to tell you directly, Amos said after 20 minutes of the silence. She tamped soil around a refilled hole with her boot heel. Go ahead. I've been talking to people in encampment about Pruitt's assessment, about what it means for land values in the basin. He moved to the next hole, working with his back to her in the way of someone who finds it easier to say certain things without direct eye contact. There's a firm out of the Territorial capital, Carver and Whitlock Land Company. They've been acquiring failed homestead claims this summer, buying them at county auction after the families defaulted on their improvement requirements. Vesper went still. 6 claims went to auction this summer because of the drought. Carver and Whitlock bought 4 of them. They've been buying failed claims across 3 counties over the past 2 years, always at below market prices, always after a drought or a crop failure gives them the leverage. He filled the hole, stood up, brushed his palms against his thighs. Your field is a problem for their model. If it becomes documented that this land is viable, that the families who defaulted did so because of management decisions, rather than because the land itself is fundamentally unworkable, the cost of their acquisitions goes up. The story they need the county to believe is that the land is marginal. Your evidence that it isn't. They're challenging Pruitt's assessment. They're telling people it was conducted improperly, that your irrigation method isn't replicable at scale, that one good season on one 4-acre parcel doesn't constitute proof of anything about the basin's broader viability. He finally turned to look at her. They haven't filed anything official yet, but they've been in conversation with 2 of the assessors who report to Pruitt. I thought you should know from me before you heard it from someone else or didn't hear it at all. The light was going flat and cold across the harvested field, the sun dropping behind the western ridge at the angle it took in October, when the days were shortening toward their minimum. Vesper looked at the refilled holes, 12 of them, indistinguishable from the surrounding soil, now no visible evidence of what had been in them or what they had accomplished. The whole summer's work reduced to its bare surface, which was nothing, which was bare ground. That was the thing about the invisible architecture. It was always invisible. Even after you extracted it, the ground closed over where it had been. Does Pruitt know? She asked. I'd assume so. He struck me as a man who pays attention to what's being said about his work. Thank you, she said. She meant it without ceremony. He collected his tools, nodded once, left without additional explanation, which was the version of Amos Shrier she had come to understand, was the one that appeared when something had actually required something of him. She wrote to Pruitt the following morning, 3 paragraphs factual in tone, describing what she had been told. She asked directly whether his assessment was under any form of review. She listed the dates of her recorded measurements. The county approval number for the water resource allocation noted that 14 individuals had witnessed the pot extraction demonstration, and that she was prepared to document the complete system in written form if that would be useful to the county's records. She sealed the letter, sent it with the Tuesday post, and spent the remainder of that week preparing the cabin and barn for winter, without allowing herself to wait for the response in any way that consumed her attention. This was a discipline she had developed over years of situations that required action, followed by waiting. You do what can be done, then you return your attention to what is in front of you, and you do not let the waiting contaminate the present. The response arrived 9 days later. Pruitt's handwriting was small and consistent, formed with the economical precision of a man who has written many official documents and learned to make every word carry its weight. The assessment was filed as completed. The queries regarding methodology had been reviewed and found without basis. Her offer to document the full system in writing was accepted and would be welcome to the county's records. She read it twice. The word accepted arrived in her chest with a different weight than she had anticipated. Not relief exactly, because she had believed Pruitt was a man who would not be moved by pressure. That wasn't backed by fact, but something more like the confirmation of a judgment that had been provisional and was now settled. The documentation took her 4 evenings. She sat at the table each night with the lamp turned high and wrote in the careful plain prose of someone who is trying to be understood by a person she cannot see rather than admired by one she can. She described every stage of the system. The clay selection process, what the right material felt like between the palms versus what the wrong material felt like. The sand mixing ratio arrived at through 30 failures before she had the proportion correct. Pot dimensions, the 3-week drying period that could not be shortened without structural cost. The burial depth, the grid spacing for different acreage sizes, the 3 sisters planting method, and the specific relationship between the plant spacing and the pot placement beneath it. The morning fill schedule and the adjustments she had made when the well's recharge rate required reduction. She drew diagrams not artistic but precise. She included the failures. The 30 cracked pots described in enough detail that someone reading about them could understand what had caused each failure and how to avoid it. The northwest corner, where the squash had shaded the beans, included as an instruction rather than an admission. The 2 sections of shallower burial that had produced inconsistent yield. A document that only described what had succeeded was not an honest document, and an honest document was the only kind she knew how to write. Jasper Shrier read the draft when she asked him to. He sat at her table for an hour with it, moving through it page by page with a pencil that he used sparingly, marking places where the text said something his mechanical mind received as incomplete. This section, he pointed to the passage on soil depth adjustment. You say to adjust for soil composition, but you don't specify how to determine the adjustment. I do it by feel. Can you describe the feel in words? She thought about it. Not the quick thought of someone reaching for an answer, but the slower thought of someone translating a physical knowledge into language it was not originally stored in. The soil should compress approximately 5 centimeters from the pot's neck under direct palm pressure without immediately rebounding. If it rebounds, the soil is too dry, reduce spacing to increase moisture. Overlap between vessels. If it doesn't compress at all, overwatering. The pot is too close to the surface. Jasper wrote that in the margin. Then he looked up. Better. She added it to the main text that evening in her own words, corrected, until the language felt like hers rather than a transcription of his. Harlon Duval came on a Thursday in the 3rd week of October. He came in the morning by himself with the quality of stillness that she had learned to recognize as his version of having made a decision and arrived to act on it. He knocked at the gate post rather than lifting the latch, which was a distinction she registered. She let him in. They stood in the harvested field. Bare row soil turned for winter rest. The pots already extracted and stacked in the barn, because there was nothing left in the field that required any particular position, and standing in it seemed right for what he needed to say. He said it. He took time to get started in the way of a large engine that requires a moment to turn over before it runs. walked the field for an hour. She went deeper with him than with anyone else because his 31 years gave him a contextual framework that made depth possible. He understood the basin's soil variation across its different sections, knew which areas sat over clay subsoil and which had better natural drainage, could translate what she described about the system into specific applications on specific parcels without requiring her to make those translations for him. He mentioned the deeper clay deposit along Rimrock Ridge 200 yards further south than where she had taken Ruth Holt, a section he had walked past 100 times without registering what the gray band in the exposed face meant. She told him she wanted to see it. "Come in the spring," he said. "I'll take you there." At the field's far edge, with the October sky sitting low and gray above the basin, and a crow moving across it in the particular unhurried way of birds that have nowhere urgent to be, Harlon said the thing she had not expected from him. "My East 40 is good land. It has been good land for 30 years. I should have had a better harvest of it this summer." He paused. "I've been farming this basin longer than you've been alive. I came out of this summer with less than you did your first time. I need to think about what that means." It was not an easy thing to have said. She could hear the weight of it, 31 years of experience and the specific kind of difficulty that comes from those years when something challenges rather than confirms what they have taught you. "It means you know this valley in ways I don't," she said. "It means I know one specific thing about one specific system that you didn't know. Those are two separate kinds of knowledge." She held his gaze steadily. "Put them together, and you'll likely do better than I did this season. You'll know where to put the system because you know the ground, and you'll know how to build it because I'll show you." The last of the stiffness left his face, not warmth replacing it, but the absence of the resistance that had been there since June, the particular rigidity of a position held past the point where the evidence supported it finally released in the cold October air without ceremony. "That's a generous way to put it," he said. "It's an accurate one." The letter from Carver and Whitlock arrived in January of 1887, on a day when the snow was too deep for any ordinary travel, and the world outside the cabin windows had been reduced to the white formless condition of a Wyoming Territory winter in its serious phase. 3 pages. Legal language deployed with the precision of men who had hired someone to make their intentions sound like standard procedure. The offer $80 for her homestead claim, framed as generous given what the letter described as the uncertain long-term viability of unconventional agricultural approaches. The second page noted that questions regarding the assessment methodology applied to her property remained under review and might affect her improvement certification status. She read it once fast, once slow. $80 was substantially below what proved improved land was worth in any county where the assessor had not been spoken to. The second page's language was a threat dressed as a concern. They were using a challenge to Pruitt's assessment that Pruitt himself had already told her was without basis, presenting it as an active uncertainty when it had already been resolved. She looked at the fire for a while. She thought about the tin box under the floorboard and what was in it. Pruitt's 9-word response, the water resource approval, her original survey form with its columns of pencil numbers. She thought about Jasper Shrier's notebook, about Martha Fenwick's test results written in her deliberate hand and delivered to Vesper She sent it when the snow permitted. She did not hear from Carver and Whitlock again. What she did receive 6 weeks after sending her reply was a 4-page letter from Pruitt's office on official county letterhead. He had filed a formal complaint against Carver and Whitlock Land Company with the Wyoming Territorial Land Commission. The complaint documented a pattern of predatory acquisition, 7 instances across 3 counties, including the 6 failed claims from Sweetwater Basin, all following the same structure. Drought reduces yields. Families fail improvement requirements. Carver and Whitlock acquire at auction prices engineered by the combination of economic pressure and interference with assessment processes. Vesper's property was cited by name as an example of viable improved land subjected to improper pressure based on misrepresentation of assessment status. At the bottom of the final page in handwriting rather than typeface, Pruitt had added 8 words. Your documentation was useful. I included it as Exhibit C. She sat with that for a long time, not because it required extended thinking, but because some things earn the time it takes to feel them fully, rather than filing them immediately into the column of things dealt with. She had not understood when she wrote those 4 evenings of documentation that it would reach beyond her own fence line. She had understood it as protection, a record that would make it harder to claim her method was unverifiable, her results anomalous, her land marginal. She had not understood it as evidence in a case involving 7 families in 3 counties. She could not fix what had already happened to the families who had lost their claims. The Territorial Land Commission's complaint might recover some of those claims, or it might not. She did not have experience with territorial land law and was honest with herself about the limits of what she could project. But what she had written, the careful, plain account of what she had done and why it worked and what it proved about this land, was sitting in an official file somewhere with her name on it. And what it was doing there was making a pattern visible that had been designed to remain invisible. Most of what keeps people alive is invisible. She had been thinking about that since the summer, the water in the buried clay, the root systems pressing against the vessel walls in the dark beneath the soil surface, the knowledge stored in her memory from a Colorado garden 3 years before she had known she would need it. The visible part, the green field that people pointed at from the road and called luck or called strange, was produced entirely by what could not be seen from the road. The documentation she had written was the same kind of thing. The record that existed in the county files that had traveled to the Territorial Land Commission as Exhibit C was invisible in the way that preparation is always invisible until the moment it becomes the only thing standing between a bad outcome and a worse one. The snow came down that January with the patience of something that has no reason to hurry. She made pots in the evenings by lamplight, her hands moving in the rhythm she had developed over the summer, the clay cool and yielding under her palms. She was losing fewer now. The failure rate had dropped from the original 30 in 100 down to 4 or 5, which still bothered her, but less than it had. She had enough to add 71 new vessels to the 260 that had survived extraction without damage, bringing her total to 331. She was planning a slightly expanded planting area for spring, pushing the system into the full 4 acres, with additional ground cleared along the southern fence. Martha Fenwick's test notes arrived in a packet in late January, written in the deliberate, unhurried hand of a woman who had learned long ago that things worth saying were worth saying completely. The low fire results were exactly as she had reported. At the October demonstration, reduced breakage, maintained porosity, structural firmness that made handling significantly easier. Vesper read through the temperature log twice, checked the clay composition notes against what she knew of the rimrock deposit's gray band, and concluded that the method was sound for their Territorial Land Commission's decision arrived in May of 1887. Two of the 6 failed homestead claims from Sweetwater Basin had been recovered and returned to their original claimants on the basis of improperly influenced assessment processes. The other 4 remained in more complex legal situations, chains of title that had been complicated by resale families that had already rebuilt their lives elsewhere. Problems that the Commission had referred to a separate review process that would take years to resolve. Carver and Whitlock had been fined and formally censured. They were not dissolved. The fine was not large enough to end them, but the censure was on record, and any future county interactions would carry that history. She read the letter at her table on a May morning with the window open and the smell of turned earth coming in from the field, where her corn was 2 weeks in the ground, and the beans were just beginning to show above the soil surface. 2 families out of 6, not justice in any complete sense. The other 4 were still somewhere rebuilding, or not rebuilding, carrying what they had lost in the way that people carry losses that arrive too quickly to be prepared for. She thought about what it meant to sit with both things simultaneously. The relief of 2 recoveries and the weight of 4 that had not been reached in time. The difference between a partial solution and no solution was real. The difference between a partial solution and a complete one was also real. Both distinctions mattered, and holding them together without letting either one cancel the other out required a kind of honesty she had been practicing all summer without quite naming it as practice. Jasper Shrier came by in the second week of April to help with the burial of the new season's pots, showing up in the morning with a digging tool and starting on the section she had marked along the southern fence without asking whether his help was wanted. They worked parallel through most of the morning before he said anything. "My father put 400 pots in his East 40, he said, moving to the next marked spot. He was in the barn at 4 in the morning through February making them. Didn't tell anyone he was doing it." Vesper looked up from her work. "How did they come out?" "Solid. He used the grey clay from the deeper deposit that Harlon showed you. Better than what we used last fall." Jasper paused. He wouldn't say it plainly, but I think he was trying to beat your failure rate. What was his rate? 3 bad pots out of 412. She was quiet for a moment. "That's better than mine." "I know." A trace of something in his voice that was almost satisfaction. "I told him." "What did he say?" Jasper grinned briefly, eyes on his work. "He said he'd been working clay soil for 30 years, and it would have been embarrassing if he hadn't figured it out." She laughed, a real one, short and involuntary, the kind that surprises you when you have been serious about something for a long time. Everett Crane arrived in June of 1887 with Martha Fenwick, who had apparently decided that arranging this meeting was within the scope of actions she was entitled to take on behalf of people she thought should know each other. Crane was 26, tall enough to be slightly uncertain about it in low-ceilinged spaces, with the look of a man who spent most of his working hours indoors and had not yet developed a settled relationship with outdoor physical space. He worked as a junior clerk at the Wyoming Territorial Agricultural Office and had, he said, been hearing about Vesper Alden for several months through channels he attributed to Martha without being more specific. Martha, who was examining the current year's squash with the evaluative attention she brought to everything, did not look up. "I mentioned Everett's work to you in the fall. You said it sounded useful." Vesper looked at her. "Did you arrange this?" "I may have mentioned you to Everett as well." She said you were the most practically minded person she had encountered in 30 years of farming. Everett offered, apparently deciding that transparency was the most efficient strategy, the intelligent part she implied rather than stated. Martha turned from the squash. "I said practically minded. The rest follows." The Territorial Agricultural Office had been Her instinct was to say no, the same instinct that had carried her through 2 years of this property. Keep the count clean. Keep the obligations simple. Keep her head pointed at the 4 acres in front of her, rather than at anything that required explaining herself to institutions she did not control. She held the instinct for a moment and examined it honestly the way she examined everything. Then she thought about the 4 families whose claims had not been recovered by the Territorial Land Commission's complaint, who were somewhere else now carrying what they had lost. She thought about what it would mean for the territory's agricultural record to have her method documented at the official level available to any county assessor. Any homesteader, any land office clerk who needed to understand what viable farming in a drought year could look like. Come in, she said. I'll make coffee. Everett stayed 3 days. He walked the field each morning with his leather case and asked questions she had not been asked before, not about the mechanism of the pots, but about the sequence of thinking that had produced the decision to use them, what she had known with certainty, what she had been uncertain about, the moment she had committed before the outcome was visible, what she had expected to lose if she had been wrong. On the second evening, with coffee going cold between them, and the last light fading outside the cabin's single window, he asked what she thought would have happened if the system had failed. I would have lost the season. She kept her voice level, not because the subject was without weight, but because the weight of it was historical now rather than present. $8 doesn't carry a person through a Wyoming winter. I would likely have had to abandon the claim. Would you have started over? She thought about it honestly, which meant she sat with the question rather than reaching for the reassuring answer. I think so, but I'm not certain I would have returned to farming specifically. When you lose everything in one particular direction, sometimes you look for a different direction. She turned the coffee cup in her hands. That's what made the decision difficult. I wasn't only betting the season, I was betting the version of myself that understood farming as the answer. Everett wrote something in his notebook. He had been writing steadily for 3 days, and the notes had accumulated into a thickness that surprised her when she glanced at the stack. What are you now? He asked. She looked at the window, dark outside, the lamp's reflection floating in the glass. The field invisible beyond it, the buried pots doing their slow work 10 inches beneath the surface. A farmer who buried clay pots in a drought, and it worked, and it became something larger than I had expected, and I am still here. She paused, still getting up at 4 in the morning. He smiled, not the performed kind, just the involuntary kind that comes from finding something genuinely true. Martha said you would be important, and that someone should write it down before you became a legend, and the facts went soft. Martha says a number of things. She said you were 23. She mentioned that was relevant. She seemed to think the age was part of the point. He looked at his notes. I think she was right. He left on the 3rd morning with 43 pages of notes. The promised copy of the final documentation arrived in September, thick with official language and the words subsurface passive irrigation in the formal heading, the phrase she had given the encampment county clerk to use, which had apparently survived all the way into the territorial record unchanged. Harlon Duval came to the gate in September of 1887 to tell her his East 40 had come in 7% above his previous best yield. He said the number carefully with the deliberateness of someone who has weighed it against 31 years of context and understands that 7% above a personal best is not the same number in every situation. On good land in a year with reasonable water, 7% would be incremental. On his East 40 in a year still drier than normal, using a system he had installed himself over the winter with clay, he had located and tested and fired at low temperature based on Martha's notes. "Come when the ground thaws," Vesper said. "We'll walk it together." He nodded. He drove back toward his property without the additional words that would have been available if he had wanted them, because he was a man who had learned somewhere in this particular year that there were kinds of acknowledgement that existed in the absence of speech rather than despite it. The formal midterm certification from Sweetwater County arrived in November of 1887, 2 years and 5 months after she had filed her original claim, not the final title that required the full 5 years. Still 3 years out, but the official recognition that her improvements were registered. Her water rights documented, her property confirmed as a viable developing homestead under the provisions of the Act. She read it at her table with snow falling outside the window. The lamp lit against the grey early afternoon. She put the certification in the tin box. She pressed the loose board down over it. She made coffee and stood at the window. Outside the harvested field lay under its first substantial snowfall of the season. The surface smoothed over the row lines, invisible the places where the pots would be reinstalled in April, indistinguishable from every other square foot of white. The invisible architecture of what she had done was tucked below the snow, the way it had been tucked below the cracked summer soil, doing nothing visible, waiting for the conditions that would make it relevant again. She thought about Calhoun Briggs in his Colorado garden, crouching over the clay necks in the soil, explaining a principle he had learned from a book he had found in a supply store years before anyone thought to ask him about it. She thought about the 30 pots she had cracked before she understood the mixing ratio. She thought about Pruitt's 8 words, about Martha's test results and Jasper's notebook and Dela Holt, who would be 13 in the spring and had asked through her mother, with the careful sideways approach of someone who does not want to appear too eager, whether she might come help plant the 3 sisters again. She had said yes before Ruth finished the sentence. The snow came down in the particular way of a Wyoming November that has decided to be serious about itself. She had 3 years left on the claim. She had a root cellar that would carry her to spring with room to plan. She had 331 clay pots in the barn waiting for April. She had a valley that had watched her work in ways it did not understand, then watched the same work produce results it could not dismiss, then come to her fence one by one to ask what she knew. She was 23 years old. She had buried water in the earth, and it had kept things alive, and she intended to keep doing it. The most important work was always the work nobody could see from the road, the pre-dawn mornings. The notched stick pressed into the mud at the same spot each day, the 4 evenings of documentation that had become Exhibit C in a case involving 7 families in 3 counties. The visible part was always the product of the invisible part, the green field in the drought summer, the certified land in November, the Territory's agricultural record that now carried a description of what she had done and how to replicate it. All of it downstream of the moment she had sat at her table with a pencil and a piece of paper and looked at the numbers until the numbers told her what she needed to do next. Preparation did not announce itself. It did not ask for witnesses. It happened in the dark and the cold and the early hours before the world had decided to be watching, and its results appeared later in the light, and people called those results luck or miracle or something they could not quite explain. She let them call it whatever they needed to call it, because the name they gave it did not change what it was. She had buried water in the earth. The earth had kept